Ready to resume, Mr. President?
The session is resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President,
The Chairman of the Committee on Finance is recognized.
Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of the General Appropriations Bill and resume likewise the period of interpellation. And for this purpose, may I ask that we recognize Senator Osmeña for his interventions on the general principles.
The consideration of House Bill 4968 is in order. We are now in the period of interpellation on general principles. Senator Osmeña is recognized on the period of interpellation. Yung ano ko nga, iPad ko sa taas. Pakuha ko.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the good sponsor yield.
Willingly, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I'd like to, at the outset, discuss the revenue program of government. And these are the sources of funds from which the government will now be able to fund the various agencies and the overhead, the MOE, and the capital outlay requested and required. First question I have is, where in the revenue program does the income from the premium on the PPP projects appear? You see, the revenue program as submitted to the Senate goes on for about from page 339 to page 362. That's about 23 pages, and
Mr. President, according to the DBM and the National Treasurer, it would fall under non-tax revenues.
on what page would that be, Mr. President?
In the BSF, Mr. President, Your Honor, it would be in page... Hindi, comparison to ng previous years. Mr. President, it would be a comparison of 2013 to 2017. It would be on page 339 of the BSF with a caveat, Mr. President, Your Honor, that if by virtue of discussions before we started, if it is with respect to the premiums paid for the Mactan terminal, it is not here. Not yet there, according to them, because it was not part of their program.
What about the premiums they had collected last year? Where would it appear here? Because the revenue program by source begins during the fiscal year 2013 and then extends to 2017. Wala pa ako nakikita dito na revenue from premiums earned on the PPP projects.
According to them, Mr. President, Your Honor, and when I refer
According
to them,
who's them?
Secretary Abad, our National Treasurer, Yusek Paul, it should be part of non-tax revenues, but it is not, because it was not part of their program revenues, given that they would not or did not know how much the premiums that would be collected for these PPP programs and projects.
I can understand that. That's for 2014. But 2013 happened over a year ago. And therefore, there must have been some premiums already collected.
Which one? May pangalawa? No, nandito ba yan? Is it here? Saan dito? Saan dito? Which item yun? Which item in non-tax? Andito yung breakdown. Andito yung breakdown. Which one? Mr. President, according to the National Treasurer, those that have come in already, particularly the NAIA Expressway, were booked under other existing, tama ba? Other existing? No, look at the item.
Other existing non-tax revenues.
You are correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. Other existing non-tax revenues.
All right, then may I have a breakdown of other existing non-tax revenues? That is a very sizable chunk of our revenues. For the year 2013, I read 65,584,000,000. For 2014, I read 47,025,000,000. For 2015, it shows 48,559,000,000. For 2016, it reads 53,159,000,000, and for 2017, it goes up to 56,177,000,000. May we please have a breakdown of this very large amount?
No, wala ba dito? Dito. What's this? It's here. Is that the breakdown of the 65? What's the breakdown of others? Mr. President, Your Honor, they're getting it, but in the BASF, the pages after 339, the breakdown is given, but it is by agency. They're trying to disaggregate it via the classification of other existing non-tax revenues.
Yes, that's a very good way to confuse us, Mr. President.
Kasama
So,
na po ako doon, Mr. President, sa us.
It would be nice if we could have the specific projects which contributed to the collection of 65 billion and then the 47 billion, etc.
Yung breakdown ng other existing. They're getting it, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, in the instance of the bid for the improvement of the terminal and the construction of a new terminal in Mactan, Cebu International Airport, the winning bidder, the awarded bidder, contributed the amount of 14,400,000,000 pesos. May we know where those funds were credited?
It went to the Treasury, Mr. President, Your Honor, according to the DBM Secretary, as part of the general fund.
Well, the funds are in Treasury. All funds go to Treasury, but that would be credited to the account of the PPP, to the account of credited to the PPP, or credited to the DOTC, or credited to...
Mr. President, I stand corrected. Mr. President, I stand corrected. I was informed that the 14.4 billion went to the MCIA, AA, and but in the end, Mr. President, it will be turned over to the National Treasury upon meeting certain milestones that are provided for in the contract. So sa ngayon, nasa MCIAA daw po yung pera.
The funds are deposited in the account of MCIAA. Does that mean that MCIAA has control of the funds? They may dispose with it as the board decides?
It's in a blocked account, Mr. President, meaning they do not have control over the money to spend it as they wish.
Well, that doesn't quite answer my concern, Mr. President. I'm saying who's got control of the funds, who can decide what to do with the funds. You see, if it's in a blocked account, that means it's under the control of either the DOTC or the Department of Finance or the DBM, and it's quite useless for you to put money in my name in my bank account and say you can't touch it.
Will it be turned over to you or not? So walang control talaga sila. Dumadaan lang sa kanila. According to the National Treasurer, Mr. President, Your Honor, essentially the MCIAA would only be a conduit because after certain milestones, it will end up with the National Treasury. Again, this is according to them in accordance with the contract.
May the chair request...
In accordance with the contract? The contract says the 14 billion will go to the national government?
May I request for a minute suspension, Mr. President? There's an
Before
ongoing
that,
debate.
before that, can the chair request that
Yes.
the sponsor speak closer to the microphone? So
Yes,
that we
Mr.
can-
President.
Thank you very much. So session suspended. Anthony.
Ready to resume. Ready to resume, Mr. President. Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, to clarify, I think the confusion was clarified. There is a new policy that was not made to apply with this particular contract, that everything should now go to the National Treasury. But in this particular instance, which antedated that policy, the situation, Mr. President, is that the money was given to MCIAA. It is with them right now, and after certain milestones are met, for example, that government is able to provide the land needed for the bigger terminal and other milestones under the contract, it will now be with the MCIAA's control. Pera daw po nila yan. However, there is an ongoing debate emanating from the National Treasurer rather, that it should be deposited there, and a GCG opinion that says that at least 50% must be declared in favor of the national government by way of dividends. So that is where we are right now, Mr. President, Your Honor. That is why there were different answers emanating from the different offices a while ago.
Well, there are several questions that arise from your statement, Mr. President. Number one, why is this being booked as income? This particular sum is really the present value of terminal fees to be paid over the next 25 years by local and international travelers that utilize the Mactan terminal. In other words, ginawa lang present value, discounted, I don't know the discount rate they use, maybe 10%. And this is already being collected by the proponent, which is Megawide GMR. So, nawala ngayon ang source of income just for operations alone, ang Mactan Cebu International Airport. So they tried to raise, to great public howl, they tried to double the terminal fees from 200 to 400, because the first 200, 188 pesos to be exact, was already being collected by Megawide GMR. So this sounds a bit unfair to me, because we have taken away already the income of the manager, the owner of the terminal, and given him nothing to replace it, when the entire cash of 14.4 billion should have gone to the Mactan Cebu International Airport Authority, given that the national government controls the board anyway. Everybody there is appointed by the President of the Republic. The Secretary of Finance is there, the Secretary of Tourism, the Secretary of Justice, the CAAP. So, Mr. President, kontrolado naman nila yan. But I was thinking that because this is a situation that does not exist anywhere in the Philippines, let us respect the independence and let them decide, let the board decide how to spend the money. You see, Mr. President, kinuha mo na yung 25-year income stream. There's the expansion and the construction of the second Mactan runway in order to accommodate heavier influx of airplanes landing and taking off. The terminal makes room for that. The terminal is being constructed and expanded to accommodate up to 13, 14 million passengers. Today we have about 4 to 5 million passengers a year, or users of the terminal. But if you're going to have 15 million, you need an extra runway. You won't be able to fit all the landings and takeoffs that are required within a margin of safety on one runway. So therefore, the construction of a second runway, including the purchase of land using the power of eminent domain, will have to be funded. And I think it would be unfair if every year they have to go and beg from the National Treasury and the DBM and say, alam mo, we have to do this. Eh dapat yung pondo, iwanan dyan muna. Now, in accounting terms, that is not income. Until it is earned, it is not income. You just got an advance on future gross income. That is not net income. So to say, for the national government to say, give me 50%, no, sir. It's only 50% of the net income or the net profit that is paid as dividends. But here you're saying, give me 50% of the gross income. I don't think that's fair, Mr. President. I think this is a policy decision that has not been well thought out, and you know, it's the answers are just coming straight from the shoulder, and without having a determined, decisive policy on really what is to be done and why. And we would appreciate it, but cuentas claras. I don't think Cebu is trying to get more than its share, but what I'm saying is that from the point of view of the national government, ang tawag po nga dyan, premium eh. Uy, bonus. Bonus sa inyo. Hindi po bonus sa Mactan Airport Authority because you collected the present value of 25 years of terminal fees. Tama ba yun?
Mr. President, admittedly, they recognize that it is an ongoing debate, even amongst and between the various government agencies handling this particular issue, and they recognize the fact that indeed it is unique in that there is a GOCC, an independent authority involved insofar as the Mactan airport terminal is concerned. And they would welcome inputs coming from this August chamber insofar as a clear policy direction on what to do in these particular situations, especially where an independent authority or GOCC.
Well, they never asked us when they were forming the terms of reference. And now that they make a boo-boo, they'll say, well, we would like some ideas from you. That is pure, utter, unadulterated rubbish. We would like a clearer definition of policy in this particular case. And not only in the case of Mactan, in the case of any other such items that may appear in the budget now and in the future, because it would not be fair to merely look at it from the point of view of the national government, but also to look at it from the point of view of the subdivision involved, and in this case, the Airport Authority of Mactan, no? And anyway, the national government is in charge. The national government controls. So what we would like to see, hopefully, is that this belongs to Mactan. Now, how they spend it, that's up to the board, and the president controls the board. So you end up controlling the same thing, but at least the board will now know, and future administrations will know, that there's this X number of pesos that can be set aside by the board to determine the expansion, to meet the expansion capital expenditures that future generations would need. You collected 25 years already. So wala na yun.
If I may, Mr. President, again, that is admittedly the situation according to the DBM Secretary. However, just to discuss by way of chronology, they actually started when they were trying to bid this out, that government was willing to provide for a subsidy. It ended up that the bidders bidded out or ended up in a bidding procedure whereby government, instead of providing a subsidy, ended up getting a premium for the construction.
Isn't that
of the
wonderful?
terminal. Precisely, Mr.
They
President.
never
Your Honor.
expected this money. So why not leave it up with Mactan Cebu?
But that's why, Mr. President, they never expected it. That's why I guess they did not also plan ahead of it in recognition of this particular situation that they did not really foresee when they thought of doing this project.
So right now, you're saying that the funds are with Mactan Cebu, they're blocked funds, and the government will make a decision as what to do with those funds. So I end up without having any answers.
Because it is, as I said, Mr. President, Your Honor, there is an ongoing debate. The National Treasurer wants all of it. GCG is saying, if at all, 50% of...
No, wait, what right does the National Treasurer have?
Parang BIR lang ho yun, palagi tayong gustong kolektahan.
I mean, it's only the BIR that's like that, di ba?
What? 50% lang, not all of it. Ba't mo daw gusto yun? Ba't mo daw kinukuha lahat?
Doon kukunin. From contingent liability. Parang set aside ng treasury.
In case lang daw, Mr. President, magkaroon ng breach and there will be a contingent liability, at least may pagkukunan daw kung sakasakali ang pamahalaan in connection with the contract it entered into. But again, Mr. President, that is the position of the National Treasurer.
Well, the National Treasurer does not make policy in this case. I mean, I'm not accepting a policy because the National Treasurer, the Secretary of Finance, I want the entire administration to make that decision. And it should be a collective, like a cabinet decision, but not to take advantage of the situation. Will say, sabi ng National Treasurer ganon, and then tomorrow they'll say, but she cannot speak for us. We decided otherwise. Why don't we do this, Mr. President? Why don't we, under your subcommittee, under your sponsorship, perhaps we can have a working group to thresh this out. And I'll tell you why. The increase filed by Mactan for an additional 200 pesos to replace the 200 pesos that is being paid now to Megawide GMR has met with public resistance. So ang ginawa po nila, okay, we'll do it in staggered amounts, 10 pesos muna. O di 10 pesos, di wala rin silang income dyan. The total revenues of Mactan, if you leave the terminal fees intact, amount to 1.5 billion pesos. They spend about 1 billion, so they book a net profit of about 500, and I'm speaking general terms and from memory. They book a profit of about 500, then they pay the government, they issue dividend payments to the National Treasury of 50% of 500. Okay, now that's gone. They need money to operate. Not only, I'm not even talking about the capital expenditure requirements that they are asking for, but just to operate on a day-to-day basis, they will need that money. That's why it is essential that we solve this thing as soon as possible. Will they take the 1 billion from, at least 1 billion from the 14 billion? The 14 billion invested, what are treasury bills paying now? 3.64%, at least makaka-income kayo doon.
As requested, Mr. President, we will form that TWG to address this issue precisely before we wrap up the discussions on the budget.
Before the wrap-up of...
Before we wrap up the discussions on the budget, Mr. President, we'll try
That's
to
by
address
next
that
week.
issue so that we can address it if necessary in a special provision or in a specific item to clarify the matter under subsidy to GOCCs.
Yes, Mr. President, because, you know, my extreme position would have been just to appropriate 14.4 billion for Mactan Cebu International Airport in this budget. So you can keep the 14 billion, we'll appropriate a similar amount. But we don't want to go that far because we don't want it that future Congresses will also try to solve problems in this manner. So I'm really looking for a more
We will set up
definite
that
set of
TWG,
rules.
Mr. President, and coordinate with the Office of Senator Osmeña.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, another item that I'd like to be able to take up is the policy on the selection of projects, public improvements, public goods. For example, the other day we had apologies to the Senate President, we had a hearing on the Iloilo City Convention Center. So that raised a howl in Cebu. Not because they were envious why Iloilo City gets a convention center, but because Cebu ended up with almost no capital improvements for the coming year. The same thing with Bohol. So sabi po nila, bakit kami wala? And this is a very natural reaction, no? So how are these projects decided upon? Who submits them? Is there a committee that says, all right, so much for this, so much for that, so much for this region? We do know that the RDCs, the RDCs are busy at work. The RDCs have their wish list, and their wish list is as long as this room. And of course, economic resources being what they are, we can never fulfill their wish list. But they do want to feel that they're being treated in a fair manner. So one province should not really get much more than the next province unless there's a regional economic justification for it. It is very easy to paper over, not paper over, but justify a need, and everybody will say, well, yeah, I needed this road, and everybody will say, well, we need also classrooms, and the other guys will say, aren't hospitals a bit more important? So if you don't have a rational way of making those decisions, and decisions which are transparent, then we're going to have problems whether it's envy or jealousy or whatnot. In fairness, they're also asking, maganda sila, nakakuha sila ng 5 billion or 6 billion for one province. Kami hiwa rito 1 billion lang. Bakit ganun?
By way of response, Mr. President, Your Honor, the inputs come either from at the local level, which is coursed through the RDCs, the Regional Development Councils, and or the projects vetted or emanating from the evaluation of the line agencies or departments, insofar as deciding which projects to approve and to give the green light to, and which projects that they will withhold such a green light. Projects 1 billion and above will be decided and chosen by the NEDA ICC as well as the NEDA board. Below that amount, Mr. President, it's the line agencies that vet and determine the projects that they will propose and eventually the cabinet before they finally present the NEP to Congress.
All right, but there's a problem there, Mr. Chair, Mr. President. You see, the line agencies don't all talk to each other. So kung medyo madunong ako, kukuha ko ng 100 million dyan kay Secretary so-and-so, kukuha ko ng 100 million dito, 100 million dito, and before you know it, somebody's got 2 or 3 billion because the line agencies don't actually coordinate with each other. So you need an overall guardian who will say, "Uy, teka muna, sumobra ka na dyan." And of course, the Secretary of DPWH might finally compare notes to the DOTC Secretary and say, "Oh, no, it would not seem fair. Two provinces who have not had either strong political connections or influential people on the inside." And what we want to try to avoid, I think you will agree, Mr. President, is that we don't want some people to feel, some of our brothers and sisters, to feel shortchanged also. Bakit ganun?
Mr. President, if I may, that is why the DBM sometimes suggests budget ceilings, because some departments indeed have a tendency to shoot for the sky, and these budget ceilings put rhyme and reason into it, but at the end of the day, it is decided upon by the cabinet as a whole, presided upon and over by the President. For example, Mr. President, in the case of DPWH, which is the most contentious department, at least insofar as the lower house is concerned, DPWH came with a program insofar as identifying the status, the condition, the length, and the slope of our national roads and bridges, and embarked on a plan to make sure that N1 roads, or the national highway, is fully concrete, and therefore that's the plan that they're following and implementing. If a particular region or province happens to be funded ahead of the other one, it will follow in the next year the entire program to be completed before the end of 2016. So in that sense, at least insofar as that department is concerned, which I am more or less familiar with, it evens out at some point in time, given the fact that the targets are well thought out and clear at the beginning.
I will venture, with all due respect, Mr. President, I will venture. Add up all of the projects the past 4 years. You will see it does not even out. Maybe that can be another assignment given to the Committee on Finance of
But
the
not
Senate.
before we
It
finish
does
the
not
budget. We'll
even
accept that
out.
assignment, Mr. President, but not before we finish the budget deliberations.
Yes,
For this
but
year.
I mean, which is why there has to be probably a special USEC under the DBM that's just in charge of what shall we say, coordination of projects. To say that, well, this was approved by the cabinet itself, well, that is the lamest excuse. The cabinet doesn't have time to make busisi. You just give them 2 or 3 pages and they'll stop reading after that. Mahirap po ito. It's really quite a headache. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Yoli retires from the Senate, she should be put in charge of this because she knows where every project is being given. So we'd like to elicit a response from the Honorable Secretary of Budget and Management that in the interest of fairness and in the interest of transparency, questions like this always come up in the budget debates. They arise in newspaper columns and we don't know how to answer them. Di namin alam eh. Sir, are you not in the part of the budget committee? Yes, I am, but it's really difficult to go through a budget this high and start trying to make sense out of it. But a special arm of the DBM could do that, anticipating already that there would be local leaders, regional leaders who would be asking questions, not only out of curiosity, but out of concern.
Mr. President, personally, I completely agree with the good gentleman. In fact, I asked that during the committee hearings on the budget of the DBM and the Department of Finance. In that, when I asked, isn't there a program, a system, or a set of factors or qualifications whereby we can allocate more equitably the resources of government? Let's say, population, i-factor in mo. I-factor in mo the level of poverty in the area. If such a formula can be formulated, so that if you subject any amounts that will be spent by the national government for each and every corner of the country, it would be more or less fair and equitable, or at least subject a portion of the total amount, if not the whole amount, because it might not be might not be an exact computation. At least a portion of the national budget be subjected to that kind of a formula, but there is, as we speak, none, and subjectiveness plays still a role in the identification and allocation of resources of our budget.
In fact, Mr. President, there already is, which is the ERA.
Yes, taking into account
The
population.
local government code already has a formula how which local governments will share in how many percent of the revenues. All right, so it's 40, 50%, and then pagbabaho dun, meron rin silang subdivision of how the funds would be applied. Now, at the national level, there's a very big chunk, particularly because the national government can take advantage of foreign loans, which really enlarges the goodies that can be given out. Now, of course, there are projects which supersede or are called what we would like to call supra projects na hindi subject to population ito. Like, for example, if we build a highway from here to Bicol, that should be in the national interest, and it should not be subject to Quezon saying, well, I want so many percent of that highway in Quezon, and it's got to be as straight a line as possible, and they will understand that. But when for other projects, DPWH projects, farm-to-market roads, dapat naman na at least meron tayong transparency and some sense of fairness, or at least you make the people feel that, okay, this is fair, good enough.
Mr. President, according to DBM, to a certain degree, they are doing that. For example, priority expenditures are being provided for and given to the 44 priority provinces they have identified where poverty incidence is high. They have geographical formulas as well as sectoral formulas in allocating the budget. Insofar as in particular the farm-to-market roads are concerned, it is concentrated on the 25 major rice-producing provinces and major coconut-producing provinces in the country. In that sense, in broad strokes at least, Mr. President.
Yes, and the DBM has been very good at doing that.
Broad
But
strokes.
ang problem lang, mahirap i-explain yun. So in the final analysis, what people do is they just add up. they'll get the DPWH budget. Bakit ang laki ng isa? All right? And then they'll get the DOTC budget. And, bakit ganito ito? And then we're left to try to explain, and it becomes difficult for us to explain. I mean, if that can be taken into consideration, if it could be anticipated that there will be people looking at it that way, then a group within the DBM should already be critiquing to be able to raise concerns that they know are going to become issues in the future.
The Secretary agrees, Mr. President, is nodding his head.
He's always agreeing, and then after that, I'll see him in the next year's budget hearing. And
Napansin niyo rin ho yun. Pansin ko rin.
all right. Now, I'd like to bring up something that might be a little bit sticky, but sorry, I'm going to bring it up here. There was an investigation ordered by the President on into the 515 million peso Muslim fund using the Office of the Muslim Affairs in Malacanang that was given to a couple of dozen of NGOs under Napoles. And the President said there'll be a special committee to investigate that, and it will be Secretary Abad, Secretary Ochoa, and Secretary Almendras. And I already said nothing's going to happen. That's like asking St. Peter to investigate St. Paul. May we know if there's been any finding, and may we have a copy of that finding?
Mr. President, apparently that committee never actually convened, and it was turned over to the DOJ as the proper agency to do the investigation, as well as with the other PDAF-related investigations.
So therefore, we can ask the DOJ for their report, because
According-
I had proposed to let the NBI do it.
According to Secretary Abad, Mr. President, that is correct. It's with the DOJ.
All right. And Secretary Abad never saw the DOJ report on that particular investigation.
According to him, he has not seen the report, neither has he been invited in regard to that investigation being conducted by the DOJ on the matter.
All right. So therefore, I'd like to reserve this time that during the consideration of the budget of the Department of Justice, I'd like to reserve
We will note
my
that,
right
Mr.
to
President, Your Honor.
interpolate.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Now, the next point I'd like to raise is a legal point. And I was wishing that the Secretary of Finance would be here, because he really is involved in one case involving this particular legal issue. It's called the right to match. I've been fighting against this right to match. For the longest time, I took the SM group of companies to the Supreme Court on this. And there have been decisions from the Supreme Court saying that the right to match is not a form of competitive bidding, giving one person the right to match the bid of another person. In the case of the bidding for the Naga power plants, because of a previous contract that had been granted to the winner of one of the 4 plants, he had now the right to match the price for the bidding of the 3 other plants that would be done in the future. Now, of course, Secretary Purisima must have felt it was legal to award it to the guy who matched. But we feel, and we've always believed this, and we've been in court since 2002 or 2004 because of this, we feel that this would really open up the government to an incredible amount of graft. If anybody would say, example lang ito, kung pwede po yung right to match, yung unsolicited offer with a right to match, I'll make an offer for this GSIS building tomorrow. Unsolicited yan. Lalapit ako kay Bernie and say, Bernie, Tito Soto and I would like to offer 1 billion pesos for this building. And of course, it's subject to a Swiss challenge. At siguro, 3 billion na mag-o-offer niyan. Just give me the right to match. O, di patay na. And there's even a pending bill here in the Senate making that official, that the unsolicited offer with the right to match will be standard will be accepted as standard government practice. This is a situation that Secretary Purisima is more familiar with, so I'd like to reserve my right that when the good secretary is able to attend our hearings, I will be able to question him on this particular issue.
If I may respond a bit, Mr. President.
Yes,
I
please.
don't know if it will satisfy the good gentleman. According to the Department of Finance, if the gentleman is referring to the Naga
Naga Cebu.
Power Plant.
The
in
Napocor
Cebu,
plant.
Yes. Mr. President, according to them, it is by virtue of a provision in the contract that the current lessee has a right not to match, but the right to top.
The right to top is the same as the right to match. Okay.
But in this particular case, his bid was 5%.
Right to
It
top
top-
by 5%, right to top by 10%, that
Similar-
right is unfair. And that's already been decided by the Supreme Court in the Kawasaki case, the Baseco, Gokongwei versus Baseco. And yet, it's being implemented, may nakakalusot. I really didn't care who would buy the plant. But I was working on the principle that we should not be allowing this right to match unless there is a previous right or a previous payment or a previous obligation. Like for example, magkapartner tayo sa isang korporasyon. So, we sign when we set up the corporation that I would enjoy preemptive rights. So if Mr. Escudero sells his share, he offers it to me first. And if I want to sell my share or get out of the corporation, I offer my shares to Mr. Escudero first. Ayun, that's recognized by law as a legitimate right. But for someone to be bidding, let us say, for the parking lot of GSIS, at pag nanalo, kung may bidding para sa building, may right to match ako. We're going to be open to a lot of crazy, one-sided arrangements, and we would lose an incredible amount of revenues because of that.
According to the Department of Finance, Mr. President, they completely disagree as well with that particular right to match, right to top. But in this particular instance, it was provided for in the contract entered into in 2007. And then when they asked for a DOJ opinion on the matter, the DOJ said that it was legal.
I will say this here. Inaayos yan ng mga DOJ opinion, OGCC opinion, OGC opinion. Tell them I said so.
But after that,
And I will name people.
that they have not done it since then.
No? Alam mo, question ko sila dito because it was, the first contract was bidded out under the term of the previous corrupt administration, no? And I will emphasize the word corrupt. They use as a model the bidding for the Masinloc 600 megawatt plant. Now, in Masinloc, it was a bit different and it was justified. The government had not fully titled all of the lands that were being used by Masinloc. So, ang sabi ng AES, the big American group that won, and the other bidders, they said, sige na. Anyway, empty land yan, we're using that as a coal bed. Just give us the right to match or the right to top. You can put that up for bidding when you finally get it titled, but we need it, so give us the right to match. We're bidding on this on the condition that we also have a chance to win that empty lot beside it because that's where we stock our coal beds. So pumayag. So when the bidding came for Naga, these are existing plants. They're old plants. One is a CCGT, which is a combined cycle gas turbine. The other two are coal. There were 4 plants. They bidded one. And they say, whoever wins this will have the right to match the other 3. And walang connection. It's just across the street, yes, but there's no connection. There's no reason why the right to match should have been given. And that's what happened here. So came the new administration, sabi nila, nasa kontrata eh. Yes, because that contract is not legal. That's not valid. And don't allow this to happen because then we're going to have similar contracts na marami dyan makakalusot. At kawawa naman si Miss Kim Menares, no? Mablaan siya ng income. And we're trying as hard as possible to increase her revenues. I'm very proud that she's now collecting on the sin tax alone. She's going to be collecting 33 billion in 2015, 37 billion in 2016, and almost 41 billion in 2017. So
More pa daw, Mr. President, Your Honor. 51 daw in 20...
tama. Sorry, I was only looking at cigarettes.
Yes, 51 in 2015, Mr. President.
It's 51 in 2015, 56 in 2016, and
Yes.
64 in 2017.
Yes, Mr. President. Yeah.
So she's got Miss Kim alone could support Mactan Airport many times over. So maybe I better make friends with her so that. In any case,
Point
that
well
is
taken,
a
Mr.
situation, Mr. President, right too much, and I'd like the Honorable Secretary of Finance, to give us categorical answers, which would be spread on the record.
Well taken, Mr. President. Your
Thank you.
Honor.
Lastly, the NEDA, my favorite. They whitewashed, of course, the existence, the economic justification for the Aurora Pacific Economic Zone. Didn't make sense to any economist. I had read it, but they already considered the 1 billion pesos there as sunk cost. So, nandiyan na yan eh. So, and I have the report of I have the NEDA report here, the assessment of the economic potentials of NEDA. After trying to hem and haw the entire report, there was a rejoinder, and I don't know why they call this a rejoinder. That's all it says. The need for a well-formulated feasibility study prior to request for government investments. By way of drawing lessons from this assessment, future investment decisions of government, especially of similar scale, should be supported by an in-depth feasibility study that does not only articulate the economic viability, but also the stakeholders' ownership of the project. Does the NEDA stand by this? The nodding of the head.
Secretary Balisacan is nodding his head, Mr. President.
Which means
Your Honor. I
this
presume
is
it means yes.
this is NEDA policy.
Yes, Mr. President.
Because I would
according
like
the
to
Secretary.
inform Secretary Balisacan that during the hearing on the budget of the APECO, the new president, the new president said that the APECO is a government corporation and it does not have to justify economically its need. I can read you the one minute.
Suspended for 1 minute.
The transcript. Bill nyo yan. You write it. Motion to resume if the chair is ready.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, just for the elucidation of the NEDA's, the Director General of NEDA, let me read in the last hearing on October 30, 2014, what Mr. Erquisa, Attorney Erquisa said. He's the new president of APECO. They change presidents every year. This is me talking, Mr. Attorney Erquisa. I will quote what you said. You said, as NEDA defined Aurora, Ecozone, and Freeport's economic viability, it must be emphasized that the Aurora Ecozone is a government instrumentality, and as a government instrumentality, it is a non-profit corporation under its charter. It is not integrated with the department framework, invested in special functions or jurisdictions by law, endowed with some, if not all, corporate powers, administering special funds, enjoying operational autonomy, usually through a charter, and as a government instrumentality, it does not need to meet the test of economic viability. And that is what floored Attorney Christian Monson, who is pretty familiar also with economic practices. It need not be economic viable, since the government may even subsidize the entire operation, as stated in one decision by the Supreme Court. Now, Mr. President, I can give a copy of this. Does he support what Mr. Erquisa says?
That's his opinion, according to the NEDA Secretary, Mr. President, Your Honor, and he completely disagrees with it and stands by the policy of NEDA as read earlier by the distinguished gentleman.
I just would like to inform the good Director General that he had a representative, the NEDA had a representative at that hearing in the person of Mr. Tungpalan. And of course, Mr. Tungpalan hemmed and hawed, and basically also tended to agree with the president of APECO. Now, Mr. President, this is like a bad egg that keeps on turning, a bad coin that keeps on turning up. And they had included an additional, on top of the 48 million peso operating budget, the APECO board had included a new appropriation of about 200 plus million pesos. Now, I was wondering, if this is not supported by any economic study, why did the DBM approve this? Why do we have to go through this battle every year? The NEDA already said, kailangan may feasibility study yan. Pagkatapos darating sila dito, may bagong additional 200 million, walang feasibility study. Ano pong gagawin natin? And this question is directed at Secretary Abad. We would like to elicit a reaction from Secretary Abad.
Mr. President, just to clarify, is this capital, are you referring to the funding per se of APECO or the capital outlay for APECO? Because if it's funding per se for APECO, according to the DBM Secretary, since it is provided for by law and created by virtue of law, they provide funds for its operation. If it's capital outlay, they proposed for the release or appropriation of such capital outlay and is and it's vetted by the department. According to the secretary, they actually on a year-on-year ask for even bigger funds, but they do not allocate nor provide for such funds as requested by APECO, which is far higher than what they are giving or have given.
Mr. President, over ₱1 billion in the people's money has been spent on this so-called free port, which doesn't have the ghost of a chance for the next 50 years to ever becoming a port. Mr. President, there is not a single locator there to this day, and they've been promising year after year. Fortunately, this is already my 5th year opposing this, and they still don't have a single locator. They were able to put, not in the ABECO budget, but in the DOTC budget, ₱400 million for the extension and resurfacing of the APECO aerodrome, which is the airstrip. And of course, it was known first as the Casiguran International Airport. And it was finished in 2011. To this day, not a single international airline has landed there. Not a single domestic airline has landed there. Nobody wants to go there, and no airline is going to set up shop there. Is going to schedule regular or even irregular flights there. We're spending and wasting an incredible amount of money there. They don't follow the COA rules. There are 19 recommendations in the COA 2011, 2012, 2013. They've followed exactly 2 of the recommendations. There's ₱501 million in assets that they cannot account for, or at least that's COA's report. So, Mr. President, maybe the DBM can give us a call when it's being considered, and not just put it in the budget, so that we don't have to, this won't take up too much of our time. First, I'd like to see the economic feasibility study. They cannot present one this past Congress without any economic feasibility study. The funding was accepted without economic feasibility study. The minorities there have rights which have been trampled upon, whether it's the IPRA, the minorities, or the farmers, because they're entitled to their rights under the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. So I'm just requesting na wag naman na itapon parati dito sa Senado yung mga ganyan, because unless there's an economic feasibility study that justifies the expenditure, I don't think it's ₱200 million. We could do a lot of things with the 200 million. I'd rather send it to, we should send it to, say, Leyte and Samar, and help build the homes of those people who have lost their homes and up to now have not had any resources to rebuild. There's no economic activity. There's no nothing over there, if you'll pardon my grammar. So this is just a request to the DBM. Please don't throw the same thing again next year, because I will stand up for the rights of those people in Casiguran. It's a small town. Nobody has been there really, and we would like to see development pursued in a manner that we all say it should be pursued. It must be inclusive. It must be with the permission of the locals. This was passed without even asking the municipal council for approval. So I'll terminate my interpellation there, but I would like to still repeat reservations to query Secretary of Finance and the Secretary of Justice. And I also would like to reserve my right to interpolate on the Department of Public Works budget later on today or tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the gracious chairman for his timely, complete, all-encompassing responses to our questions.
Thank you for your generosity, Mr. President, Your Honor, and thank you, distinguished colleague. Mr. President, no other member registered to interpolate on the general principles of the 2015 proposed national budget. May I therefore move that we close the period of interpolations and debate on such general principles. So moved, Mr. President.
In objection, there being none, the period of interpolation for the general principles on the 2015 General Appropriations Bill is hereby terminated.
May I request for a minute suspension, Mr. President?
Suspended for 1 minute.
Neda.
Thank you, thank you.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we begin consideration and take up the budget of the Department of Finance as well as its attached agencies, and for this purpose, may I ask that we recognize our distinguished acting minority floor leader, Senator Soto, for a manifestation and for some interventions, perhaps.
The consideration of the budget of the Department of Finance is in order. Senator Recto is recognized for this purpose. I'm sorry. Senator Recto is recognized to respond to questions on the period of interpellation, and for this purpose, Senator Tito Soto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have just received a copy of the letter of the BIR Commissioner to the Congressional Oversight Committee, particularly calling the attention of Ms. Bernardine Mahinay. And these matters that I would like to take up can be taken up in the Congressional Oversight Committee. Therefore, I don't think it has anything to do with the budget of the BIR. So I will forego interpolations for the budget of the Department of Finance as a whole, because also the issue that I would like to take up with the Bureau of Customs does not have anything to do with their budget, Mr. President. So I will forego that as well and just take it up in the Congressional Oversight hearing. Thank you, Mr. President, and I wish to thank the distinguished sponsor, Senator Recto, for accommodating this representation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there is no one in the list to question the budgets of the BIR, the Bureau of Customs, the Bureau of Local Government Finance, the Bureau of Treasury, the Central Board of Assessment Appeals, the Cooperative Development Authority, the Insurance Commission, the National Tax Research Center, and the PMO. Having said that, Mr. President, may I, request for the recognition of the Majority Leader?
Just the acting
The
majority
Chairman
floor
of the Committee on Finance is recognized.
As acting majority floor leader, Mr. President. Mr. President, we would like to thank the distinguished acting minority floor leader for his manifestation that they have no further interpolations. Mr. President, no other member registered to interpolate on the budget of the following offices under the Department of Finance, namely the Bureau of Customs, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the Bureau of Local Government Finance, the Bureau of Treasury, Central Board of Assessment Appeals, Cooperative Development Authority, Insurance Commission, National Tax Research Center, and Privatization and Management Office. May I therefore move, Mr. President, that we close the period of interpolation and debate for the aforementioned offices and agencies under the Department of Finance. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. The period for interpellation on the budget of the offices mentioned by the Chair of the Committee on Finance, the offices under the Department of Finance, is hereby terminated.
For clarity, Mr. President, we have not yet closed the period of interpolation and debate for the Office of the Secretary proper and the Securities and Exchange Commission, which we will set once the Department Secretary, Secretary Purissima, is available and ready to attend our sessions.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this juncture, Mr. President, may I request for 1 minute suspension so that we can situate the NEDA to be sponsored by Senator Recto.
Before that, I see the Chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission present. If there are no questions,
may I request for 1 minute suspension, Mr.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I, given that no member registered to interpolate on the proposed budget or subsidy to the PDIC, may I likewise move that we close the period of interpolation for the same? I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. Carried.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the meantime, may I ask that we recognize Senator Recto to sponsor the budget of the NEDA? And for this purpose, may I ask that we recognize Senator Ejercito for his interventions and/or interpolation? I so move, Mr. President.
The Vice Chairman of the Committee on Finance, Senator Recto, sponsor of the budget of the National Economic Development Authority, is recognized to respond to questions on the NEDA budget, and for purpose of this period of interpellation, Senator Ejercito is recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. With the gentleman, here to some questions and some clarificatory questions regarding NEDA.
Willingly, Mr. President, thank you to the gentleman from Samoa.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, I'd just like to ask NEDA, according to President Aquino in his last SONA, there was a decrease of about 3% in the first semester of 2012 of the country's poverty incidence. From 27.9%, it went down to 24.9%. That, Your Honor, Mr. President, is equivalent to about 3 million Filipinos relieved from the poverty line. I'd just like to ask, Your Honor, Mr. President, did the NEDA use the same formula in the past in computing the level of poverty incidence?
Yes, Mr. President. But what I do have, Mr. President, is that in 2006, poverty incidence was 26.6%. In 2009, it was 26.3%. And in 2012, it is 25.2%. And you mentioned what years, Mr. President?
2012. Again, is it 25? About 25%.
25.2%.
Yes, almost this. But in the report of the President during the SONA, it went down by about 3%, if I remember it right.
What I have is the official government statistics, Mr. President. Families. Yes. Yes. That statistic is based only on the first semester of 2012 and 2013.
Yes, Your Honor, Mr. President. So there's an improvement of about 3%?
For that particular semester, Mr. President. Now, in terms of annual, the official data in 2006 this one, di ba? And ito here. The annual is for 2006 26.6%, for 2009 26.3%, and for 2012 25.2%. That is the annual. What you mentioned earlier and what the President mentioned during his SONA was the first semester of 2012 and the first semester of 2013.
So, Your Honor, Mr. President, to what do we attribute the improvement of the poverty incidence? Is it through new jobs? Because with that much, it's about, with 3 percentage points, it's about 3 million.
Yes. Again, the improvement is due to a combination of the social services in the budget, spending, economic services, and principally the growth in the economy, Mr. President.
What is the, Your Honor, Mr. President, what is the estimated number of jobs that were created during those periods, wherein the poverty incidence improved a lot, as reported by the President?
And if you're asking about employment, the employment rate in 2012 was 93%, and in the average of 2013 was 92.9%. Yes. And the employment generated in 2012 was 408,000. In 2013 was 518,000. It is worth to note that in April of 2004, it's 1.654 million, Mr. President.
That's the new jobs created, Your Honor?
Yes, employment generation.
1.65
as
million.
of April.
So, Your Honor, Mr. President, 1.65 million is, if you would, that would be about if you would consider about 5,000 companies, big companies, that would times 300, that would come out to about 1.5 million. So, 5,000 employees, these are companies as big as Smart, Globe, and the other big companies. But, Your Honor, Mr. President, I have no information that about 600 companies of this size, was created during this period.
What I can tell you, Mr. President, is this. Clearly, there is a huge portion of the population, and I agree with you, living below the poverty threshold. That is one. No? We are not making enough jobs necessary as well. No? But it must begin with the economy growing. And yes, the economy is growing over the last 4 years. In fact, the budget has almost doubled in size because of the growth in the economy. The challenge is for us to have inclusive growth, Mr. President. And that is why government has continued to spend on social protection as well, among other things. But the challenges remain, Mr. President. But the prerequisite to reducing poverty is growing the economy. And that is happening, Mr. President. Now, it takes almost a decade to reduce poverty incidence and to create the quality jobs, Mr. President. You cannot do it overnight. And for as long as we grow by 7% annually for the next decade, then I suppose that we will be able to significantly reduce poverty in the medium term, Mr. President.
Thank you for that, Your Honor, Mr. President. Next point, I'd just like to ask the preparations being done by the NEDA and the different agencies with the upcoming ASEAN integration. Just like to ask Your Honor, Mr. President, how much fund was allocated by NEDA for the upcoming in the preparations, for the ASEAN integration?
Well, generally speaking, Mr. President, like I said, the budget has tremendously been increasing. The budget for infrastructure has also increased tremendously. In fact, if you look at the top 10 budgets of the different departments from 2010 to 2015, the budget of the Public Works Department, which will help improve our competitiveness as well, in 2010 was 126 billion. In 2015, it will be 290 billion. The Department of Education for Human Resource Development, 161 billion in 2010. It will double to 322 billion in 2015. For the DSWD, the budget in 2010 was only 15 billion. It's going to be 109 billion in 2015, Mr. President. So, investments are being made in both human resource development, in infrastructure, in social development, and economic development. That is to prepare our people for the ASEAN integration as well, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. President. I'd just like to ask also, Your Honor, for example, in particular, do you think the sugar industry is prepared to compete with the cheap sugar coming in from Thailand? By 2015 is less than 2 months from now. So, just want to know how prepared are the industries?
from what I recall, Mr. President, there is a bill being deliberated here in the Senate as far as the sugar industry is concerned, to help them out as far as ASEAN integration is concerned.
Yes, Your Honor,
But we
that's a
seem
sugar
to-
bill, Your Honor.
Yes, we seem to be competitive in sugar with the exception of, I suppose, Thailand as a competitor, and they are probably cheaper in producing sugar, Mr. President. But the sugar industry, its restrictions in importing sugar as far as quality is concerned. I think the Port of Manila, I think they've lobbied also with your father for certain restrictions maybe in the Port of Manila. So yes, the sugar industry itself, even the private sector, is working with the local government units as well.
Your Honor, Mr. President, likewise, not only sugar, it's the rice industry. Right now, we're importing heavily from Vietnam and Cambodia.
Yes, with regard to rice, there is still that duty protection, Mr. President. That has not gone down, I think, until 2017. So we are still buying time as far as rice is concerned.
But, Mr. President, Your Honor, Mr. President, aren't we considering asking for an extension? Because the way I see it, I don't think the industries are prepared, no? Because what we have are rundown or old rice mills, sugar mills.
My recollection as far as rice is concerned, we have already asked for an extension until 2017
2017, no?
with regard to tariffs, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor, Mr. President. Next point, I just like regarding Mindanao, no? Mindanao has, our brothers and sisters in Mindanao feel that they always get a small portion of the pie. Luzon usually gets about 60%. Visayas and Mindanao split the remaining 40%. Just like to ask NEDA, how many PPP projects were approved by NEDA, no, for Mindanao?
For Mindanao, there's none, no? PPP.
And how much is allotted likewise?
There are there are three. Laguindingan Airport, that has been approved by the NEDA board.
Davao Airport,
Davao Airport
Davao Sasa Airport,
and Davao Sasa Airport.
Port, Davao Port, Sasa.
Those are the three PPP projects in Mindanao, Mr. President.
Your Honor, Mr. President, I believe the head of the PPP is here. Does she have a ballpark figure of how much the total cost of investments or those projects are?
Davao Airport is estimated project cost is 40 billion, Mr. President. The Davao Sasa Port modernization is 18.99 billion. The Laguindingan Airport is 14.6 billion.
Okay, Your Honor, Mr. President, last point, I'd just like to ask the status of the North Rail and South Rail from NEDA. No? I believe that it was not continued because of the issues of suspicion of corruption. But what is the status now?
It is a preparation phase, Mr. President.
Preparation. So, when do we expect those projects to commence? Because right now, Mr. President, Your Honor, congestion problems, no, are already becoming very evident. And I feel that one of the solutions to decongest Manila and likewise to spread development all over the country, not only in the key cities,
Yes.
is the establishment or of this of the North Rail and South Rail.
Yeah, Mr. President, I am told that it will be submitted for consideration of the NEDA board by the first quarter of next year.
All right. So from 2010, it was stopped, no? That was, Your Honor, that
is
was the
correct,
time
for
that
the
it was.
North Rail, yes.
So for the past 4 years, we've been reviewing, and it the problem, Your Honor, Mr. President, is that we have the right of way. It has been cleared, but now it probably informal settlers have returned. No?
There
it
is
will
a
be-
North-South Commuter Railway Project Phase 1. So this is the Malolos to Tutuban, ODA funded 117 billion. Awaiting NEDA board confirmation. No? Or approved. Approved na ba to? Await for NEDA board approval.
When does this start? When does this commence, Your Honor? Sir.
The ICC approved the project on October 29. Certain things are being undertaken right now. Like I said, it will go to the NEDA board for confirmation, hopefully in the first quarter of next year.
Your Honor, Mr. President, the reason I ask because with the president's term is due to end in about a year and a half. We want to see to it that most of this infrastructure, especially the major infrastructure projects, are fast-tracked, no? Because in the past 4 years, it has slowed down. So I'm glad that all of these big-ticket items and major infrastructure projects have already commenced. So
I am one with you, Mr. President.
yes. Well, Your Honor, I just reserve the details of because I would want to ask tomorrow when the OTC. I'd like to thank Your Honor, Mr. President, and NEDA for answering my questions. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Is there any other senator who has reserved time for interpellation on the NEDA budget? Mr. Sponsor? Senator Soto.
President. Thank you, Mr. President. I have been informed by Senator Honasan that he is withdrawing his reservations to ask questions with the NEDA.
Okay, Senator Honasan has withdrawn his reserved time for interpellation on the NEDA budget. Yes, Mr. Senator Escudero.
Mr. President, no other member registered to interpolate on the budget of the National Economic Development Authority as well as its attached agencies and offices. May I therefore move that we close the period of interpolation and debate of the Office of the Director General proper, the Philippine National Volunteer Service Coordinating Agency, the Public-Private Partnership Center of the Philippines, the Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute, the Tariff Commission, the Philippine Statistics Authority, as well as the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. I so move, Mr. President.
What about the Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council?
As well as the Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, Mr. President. I so move, Mr. President.
All right. Any objection? Hearing none, the period for interpellation on the budget of the NEDA and its attached agencies, including PIDS and the LED and the LADA, is hereby terminated.
Mr. President, may I also include the termination of the budget of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies?
It was already mentioned.
It was mentioned.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I ask for 1 minute suspension and request the DepEd family to kindly situate themselves behind the sponsor. I so move, Mr. President.
1 minute suspension.
Tawag na si Grace. Depend, yeah. Yeah. Kasi hindi ah. Hihingi ng data yung mga ano. Because when they asked me about the definition, I couldn't distinguish between the two. Precisely. Isa na disaster, isa wala. Isa na civil, isa wala. Isa na civil, isa wala. Isa na dangerous, isa wala. Ready to resume, Mr. President?
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, may I now move that we begin consideration of the budget of the Department of Education as well as its attached agencies and open the period of interpellation. I so move, Mr. President.
The consideration of the budget of the Department of Education is in order. The chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Escudero, is recognized to defend the budget.
Thank you,
Present
Mr.
and defend the budget
Thank
of
you,
the
Mr.
Department
President.
of Education.
May I ask that we recognize Senator Pia Cayetano for interpellation and or interventions on the budget of the DepEd as well as its attached agencies. I so move, Mr. President.
Senator Pia Cayetano is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Chair, as chairman of the Committee on Education, Arts and Culture, I have had the opportunity, and I was in the budget hearing for the Department of Education. So I will not take up the time of the body for my questions, except that I will submit my list of questions which I need answered in connection with the work I am doing in the Committee on Education. And it's very important, and I have requested for it in the last hearing we had on the salary increase of teachers, which may very well affect the next budget hearing if we pass that bill. We did not get the data, and on November 5, our committee secretary sent a letter following up on that data. I will submit it again, along with my questions, which are very basic. They're really just fact gathering. How many public school teachers do we have? How many kindergarten volunteer teachers? How many LGU teachers? We need all of this because in discussing this budget, in discussing the next two budgets under this administration, we would like to at least, and it will be my last term as well, we would like to be sure that we have the facts and we can be realistic in the budget that we are allocating. Specifically, Mr. President, I also need information on any transition fund that was discussed in the hearings to prepare for K-12. Is there a specific item in the budget on a transition fund for the grade 11 and 12 teachers? And that's where, to be able to support that budget, we need to know how many teachers will there be. Have we done our count on the state college and university teachers we can tap? So medyo marami to. Ito, mga questions talaga to pang hearing. And I don't mind a general answer, but this will affect how we look at the budget.
We will provide, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, they have a partial compliance already with me insofar some of the data requested by the good senator is concerned. And if we get the list, they will comply, Mr. President. Hopefully, by when? According to them, Mr. President, Your Honor, they'll give you what they have right now insofar as some of the data requested by the good senator, and they will comply as soon as they see the list, Mr. President,
Okay.
Your Honor, kung ano pa yung kulang daw nila by Monday.
And then maybe after our other colleagues have asked their questions, whoever can respond can sit down with my staff so that we can go through whatever data is available and, be clear about it.
ASEC Tony will sit with
Okay.
your staff, Your Honor, Mr. President.
Yeah, we can do it after so that he can be made available for the other colleagues of ours. So thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, may I now ask that we recognize Senator Poe for her intervention, interpellation, and or manifestations, if any.
Senator Grace Poe is recognized.
Mr. President, I am fully supportive of the DepEd budget because I always value that the most important guarantee of our Constitution, that education should be accorded the highest priority and the highest budget among the sectors. Mr. President, I would also like to express appreciation to the Chair of the Senate Committee on Finance for assisting our advocacy of providing free meals to public school to school children in public elementary schools, especially those that are severely wasted. Thank you also to the advice of Senator Ralph Recto on how we will be able to source it from the current budget that was approved. For the records of the LBRMO Finance Committee, the additional budget for school year 2014-2015 feeding is about 2 billion pesos for a total of about 3.2 billion. Just for the record, Mr. President, I would like to make sure that it is on the record that we have that particular budget approved and allotted for the DepEd. And I would also like to thank the chairman of the Education Committee, Senator Pia Cayetano, for being supportive of this initiative for the lunch program for children. And hopefully we will have this bill passed to institutionalize a lunch program in all public elementary schools, at least the very early stages of public elementary school education. Just a few questions, Mr. President. In DepEd Order 37, we are institutionalizing the school-based feeding program for school year 2014-2015 for the severely wasted and undernourished. I would just like to clarify, Mr. President.
Originally, Mr. President, Your Honor, as presented in the NEP and GAB, it only covered 100% of the severely wasted and only 8% of the wasted. However, as amended by your Senate Committee on Finance, it would cover 100% already of the severely wasted as well as 100% of the severely wasted in terms of amounts in real terms, including PS. From the GAB, meaning the budget as approved by the House, it was 1.7 billion. As approved by the Senate, it will be 4.2 billion, or an incremental increase of about 2.499 billion.
So this will cover severely wasted.
As well as wasted, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Just for the record, can we, not everybody would know this scientific term, could we ask from the DepEd a clear distinction between severely wasted and wasted?
They gave me a formula which up to now I do not understand, Mr. President, Your Honor. Severely wasted is severe deficit in tissue and fat mass for the person's height, BMI or body mass index for age is below negative 3 Z score line, dangerously thin for one's height. Tinagalog po nila, sobrang payat sa kanyang taas. Yung wasted, tanggalin niyo ho yung word na severe, deficit in tissue and fat mass. They're using a different formula, BMI for ages between -2 to -3 Z score line. Tinanggal yung word na dangerously, thin na lang for one's height. O sa Tagalog, ginamit din po nila, payat sa kanyang taas. Kaya po minabuti namin i-cover na lang pareho dahil sa tingin ko there's a hairline distinction between wasted and severely wasted, and they both need the attention of government anyway at this stage in their young lives.
That's why I'm grateful, Mr. President, that the chairman of the Finance Committee has really seen the necessity of this particular program of the DepEd. Now, just for the record, Mr. President, I would like the DepEd to state how many severely wasted students will be covered in this particular budget and how many wasted students will be covered. And for the record also, that it will include all regions in the country.
533,425 severely wasted pupils or students, Mr. President, plus 1,385,039 wasted pupils or students, for a total of 1,918,464 to be covered for 120 feeding days nationwide, Mr. President, meaning all schools where they may be found.
So, nangangahulugan po na halos 2 milyong mga estudyante ang magkakaroon ng benepisyo ng pagkain sa paaralan ng 120 araw.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, pero hindi po lahat ng estudyante sa loob ng paaralan, yung wasted at severely wasted po lamang, hindi pa rin po ito party.
Pero mas masaya ang party. Siguro sa susunod, lahat na. Pero magandang umpisa po ito na ating ginagawa. I would also like to request that the DepEd, with rolling out this particular project, I think this will be the biggest in terms of the feeding program of recent that the DepEd would have. If you can make sure that you have all of the studies to support the monitoring of this program, so that we can use this as a basis to push for a standard party feeding program.
Actually, Mr. President, Your Honor, if the program works as it should based on their studies, the numbers should come down, because I presume these students would be graduating from being severely wasted or wasted to being normal and at par and average insofar as the BMI formula is concerned.
Isa na lang po, Mr. President. Gusto ko rin po ipaalala sa DepEd na ang mga korporasyon katulad ng Jollibee, halimbawa San Miguel, na nagkakaroon ng feeding program na nakakatulong talaga, sila po ang ating tinutularan na pwede pala at may posibilidad na tulungan ng ating mga estudyante sa pamamagitan ng pagkain. Kung pwede po, kung meron pong lalapit sa inyong tanggapan na isang korporasyon na gustong mag-donate dahil nga ang binibigyan lang natin ay ang mga talagang butot balat ng mga bata. Sana po meron na kayong programa na ito ang mga paaralan na nangangailangan, ito ang magiging amount na kakailanganin nila para hindi na sila mahirapan dahil imbis na idiretso nila ang donation, let's say, sa amin, pwede na nilang ibigay sa paaralan.
Mr. President, according to DepEd, the DepEd Secretary in particular, they have an Adopt a School program which includes a feeding program for such schools. Yun po, party na po yun.
Yun.
Hindi lang yung balat ika nga.
Maraming salamat. So, panghuli na lang po siguro, gusto ko na lang pong sabihin na yun talagang monitoring napakahalaga. So, pag naumpisahan po, kung pwede lang ibigay. At saka, yung mga paaralan ba na ito, dahil sa tingin ko halos lahat ng eskwelahan meron pong severely wasted. Alam na po ba ng mga principals kung ano ang gagawin at ano yung kanilang mga recipes na gagamitin?
Meron daw po silang menu at formula at on-site po ang gagawing pagluluto ng mga pagkain at hindi po manggagaling lahat sa isang lugar lang, particularly sa Central Office o Metro Manila.
Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat uli sa Chairman ng Finance Committee sa inyong tulong.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished colleague. At this juncture, Mr. President, may I ask that we recognize Senator Nancy Binay for her interventions, questions, and her interpellation.
Senator Nancy Binay is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, noong hearing po ng budget sa committee level ng Philippine High School for the Arts, napag-usapan po yung kuryente nila. Can I just get an update kung meron na hong kuryente ang Philippine High School for the Arts?
Wala pa daw po, Mr. President, Your Honor, but if I remember correctly, the DepEd Secretary committed to talk to Meralco if they can source out the funds or help from Meralco. Total budgetary requirement na hindi na raw po dadaan sa BSP is 19.
Hindi mo. Nakikigamit lang sila ng linya na.
Mr. President, Your Honor, nagbago po yung amount dahil yung unang dalawang option na binigay nila po sa atin at 13 million na dadaan sa BSP at 9 million na may independent na linya na at separate meter ay hindi na raw po applicable. The new amount, Mr. President, Your Honor, was pegged at 19 million. Ang nakuha daw po nila sa Meralco ay discount lamang na 5 million. So ang kailangan daw po ay 14 na milyon para itayo yung connection o mga poste.
So, Mr. President, as of the moment, wala akong kuryente sa nasabing eskwelahan na ito?
Generator po, may kuryente po from a genset but not from the main grid.
Mr. President, siguro during the period of amendments, I would like to propose that we give the 14 million budget that is needed to provide electricity for Philippine High School for the Arts.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor, at the proper time we would be open to such a proposal. I was merely discussing
Unless the chairman would already accept it.
I was just merely discussing, Mr. President, with the good secretary, since we are constructing a distribution line that will advantage of Meralco dahil dati wala naman sila nabebentang kuryente dyan at hindi naman siguro mahalagang pag may ariin pa yan ng Philippine High School for the Arts. If Meralco at some point will have some offsetting mechanism para yung in-invest natin sa distribution line na yan, mapunta sa kanila, i-offset nila sa kuryenteng babayaran in the future ng Philippine High School for the Arts. We will be exploring that, Mr. President, Your Honor, before we agree on that, before we fix the amount.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Moving on another matter, ano na po ba ang status ng bilang ng mga classrooms natin?
While they're getting it, Mr. President, Your Honor, in terms of broad strokes, zero backlog po tayo sa 2010 backlog ng classrooms as of 2010. But of course, nadagdagan nyo ng 2011, 2012, 2013, and part of 2014. We are constructing classrooms for the grades 11 and 12, and at the same time still catching up with the backlog after 2010. We will get the figures for you. As of today, Mr. President, Your Honor, we have about 600,000 classrooms.
That is the backlog, or that
No,
is
that's
the available?
total inventory of classrooms, Mr. President. Your
And
Honor.
what is the backlog? From year 2011 onwards.
Zero ka na. Ang problema kayo, 11, 12, 13. That's for what? 11, 12, 13? After 2010, Mr. President, Your Honor, and excluding grades 11 to 12, we have a backlog of 41,428 classrooms.
But those are on currently
And for
some are on
41,000 classrooms.
41,428 classrooms, but that is currently, Mr. President, Your Honor, funded already under the 2014 and the proposed 2015 national budget. Ito pong 41,428 na kulang pa.
So this will cover the 2011 up to 20...
Up to 2014,
2014.
Mr. President, Your Honor.
So technically, there's no need for an additional budget for classrooms?
It's proposed already in 2015, Mr. President, Your Honor, but you're still talking of the backlog that will be created in 2015 because this only addresses the backlog until 2014.
And Mr. President, do you have a figure on that backlog?
Sa 2015 man na kaya? They base it on actual enrollment, Mr. President, Your Honor. So it's always a semester late. The data on the backlog will always be a semester late for the current year.
And yung mga classrooms na to, what is the student size per classroom?
40 to 40. And 7 by 9.
The classroom size is 7 by 9, Mr. President, Your Honor, which should fit 40 to 45 students.
2 shifts.
Only in around 700 schools and mostly in the
They only have shifting, Mr. President, in about 700 schools, according to the Secretary, and most, if not all of them, are in the NCR area.
And Mr. President, hindi pa ho kasama dito yung mga nabagyo.
That's a separate budget covered by either the QRF of the DepEd or the Rehabilitation Fund, both in the programmed and unprogrammed funds.
And that fund already covers the need, the QRF fund.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor. So far, because there is also an issue of absorptive capacity insofar as the number of classrooms they can construct in a given period and in a given locality. But we have provided, Mr. President, Your Honor, for last year alone, for this year rather alone, 100 billion in both programmed and unprogrammed funds for rehabilitation and reconstruction. If you add to that the supplemental budget of approximately 14 million and the extension of the validity of the budget of 23 billion, you're talking of a total of approximately 140 billion for rehabilitation and reconstruction, which includes school buildings damaged by natural calamities.
That will be all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor. May I now ask to be recognized.
Thank you, Senator Binay. Yes,
Senator Soto, the acting minority floor leader, for his interventions and interpellations.
Senator Soto is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished chairman of the Committee on Finance favor us with some answers for some questions that we have for the Department of Education's budget?
Willingly, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Knowing that the Secretary of Education is here, would like to know the challenges that they are facing in the implementation of the K-12 program and how they are addressing these challenges.
Basically, Mr. President, Your Honor, logistics, time and motion issues in connection with additional 2 years remain to be challenges, as well as the matching
Logistics
of the programs and community needs. For example, Mr. President, Your Honor, given that these are 2 new additional year levels, they have to grapple with issues on training of teachers, as well as hiring of teachers for these subjects, given that the curriculum is also new, Mr. President, Your Honor.
What about acceptance in the communities of the program itself, considering that there will be 2 new years?
Mr. President, Your Honor, according to them, they have conducted over 3,000 town hall type meetings, and they have explained the additional 2 years adequately, and the level of And Mr. President, Your Honor, it enjoys, after being understood, it enjoys the support of the parents according to the DepEd. On our part, Mr. President, Your Honor, this is coming from me already and not the DepEd. I think after the K+12 program, we have to adjust some of the laws we passed. Given the poor quality of high school graduates prior to K+12, we have been increasing the educational attainment requirement for certain eligibilities. For example, in government, naalala niyo po noon, high school graduate, pwede ka na mag-police. Nagpasa tayo ng batas na ginagawang college graduate. Perhaps on our part, we should also review some laws that imposed a higher educational attainment, given that the K+12 will hopefully enable and capacitate graduates from the program to already work in government or in the private sector. So from the point of view of parents, it's not an additional 2 years before their children can land a job. It's actually minus 2 years before they can land a job.
Given that, would you say that if a survey was conducted, the majority of the people would be in the positive as far as acceptance and realization of the need for the K+12 program, Mr. President?
Mr. President, last year they conducted a survey commissioning the SWS, and according to them, over 2/3 were in agreement with the program based on that survey last year.
Thank you. Good. That somehow fortifies the feedback that I have been receiving. It's practically the same. Initially, they are apprehensive, and then later on, when it is explained, the acceptance is better. And hopefully, we will not be proven wrong in the future. Thank you for that. Now, regarding the proposed increase in the allocation of personal services from 220 billion, 0.6 billion last year to 255.2 billion this year, will this increase be allocated to include or lure new teachers, or will it be used to increase the salary of existing teachers, or both?
These are for new teachers, Mr. President,
New
Your
teachers.
Honor.
What about the increase for salaries of existing teachers? Have you considered that already?
Not covered, Mr. President, yet, because according to DepEd and DBM during the committee hearings, they are still doing a study.
With due indulgence of the chairman, can he speak to the microphone?
Yes,
Can
my
he-
apologies, Mr. President. They're still doing a study on the matter of salary increases for teachers because it would impinge on the budget henceforth once we approve a salary increase. We are simply awaiting for that study, Mr. President, Your Honor.
All right. But also, according to your budget proposal, 92% of teaching positions as of September 2014 are already filled up. No? What steps are being taken by the DepEd to ensure that all teaching positions will be filled up 100% na? Can we ensure the number of teachers will be proportionate to the student population nationwide or a particular area, Mr. President?
Mr. President, they are endeavoring to fill it up 100%. However, there are some issues involving compliance with certain documentary requirements before a teacher can actually be considered as already hired officially and before he or she will begin receiving his or her salary.
Hindi masamang lumampas no? Yung lampas. Instead
Lampas.
of 100%. Lampas ng 100%. I mean,
Hindi
there
po
are-
pwede dahil wala na po silang pera pansweldo nila. Next year naman po pag may bagong item.
Dagdagan kaya natin, Mr. President. Thank you. Mr. President, going to the MOOE, I accept your answer, Mr. President, for the record.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Going to the MOOE, which accounts for 41.5 billion of the budget, out of the said amount, 2 billion is allocated for the training of 160,000 teachers. What are these training referred to, and how would this be implemented? Will all teachers undergo training? Who are the 160,000? And yes, Mr. President.
It's for the rolling out of the K plus 12, the new curriculum, Mr. President,
okay.
for the K plus 12, more particularly, Mr. President, in training 160,000 teachers during the summer months, in teaching grades 4 and 10 under the new curriculum, and training on arts, differentiated instructions, ICT, livelihood technology, multiliteracy and numeracy, science, special education, and sports in the amount of 2 billion, Mr. President.
So that is for the 2 billion. How much will be spent or paid for each teacher who will undergo such training?
They won't be paid any amount, Mr. President, Your Honor. The amount of 2
yes.
billion will be for the cost of the
Yeah,
training.
I should have asked how much is the cost of training one teacher? I'm sorry.
Approximately 6,500 to 7,000 pesos per teacher, excluding traveling expenses, Mr. President. Traveling expenses, Mr. President, will be sourced from local MOE funds.
How long will this training take place, Mr. President?
It would vary, Mr. President, from anywhere between 6 to 8 days, depending on the subject matter covered by the training.
Okay. Thank you. Earlier, you took this up with Senator Poe. And it was also, I understand, taken up by Senator Recto earlier. About 1.4 billion will be used for the school-based feeding program for 533,425 severely wasted learners. I wanted to ask who are these severely wasted learners that you are referring to. You answered it somehow earlier in the questions, but would that be the same answer if I ask how do they qualify to be in the feeding program?
As long as they fall within the definition, Mr. President, Your Honor, of wasted and severely wasted based on the body mass index formula I gave earlier, that would cover both severely and wasted pupils and or students. And according to DepEd, they have the data to identify these students on a per school basis.
Ano yun, tinitimbang ba yun?
Among others, Mr. President, Your Honor,
Among
also
others.
they would also get the height.
Saan galing yung term, Mr. President? Why the term severely wasted? Parang, kung hindi ko naintindihan yung definition ninyo nung una, ang dating sa akin masakit eh.
It's a
Severely
WHO
wasted.
definition, Mr. President, to be consistent
Alright.
insofar as the data our DepEd is producing, also in line with the MDGs.
Ayaw nyo bang sabihin malnourished na lang o severely malnourished instead of wasted?
According to Secretary Luistro, Mr. President, Your Honor, the technical definition of malnourished also includes obese, meaning at the other end of the spectrum. Malnourished pa rin daw ang tawag doon for as long as you do not fall under the category of the normal body weight.
So, so talagang is there no other term? Sakit pakinggan eh.
Alam ko po dahil ginagamit po sa salitang kanto yung pag sinabi mong
Correct.
wasted, either laseng o high.
Hindi, tsaka in the drug enforcement community, that is there is another use for wasted. It means removal from the face of the earth.
Mr. President, Your Honor, according to Secretary Luistro, the term undernourished covers both wasted and severely wasted, but for reportorial purposes, in international surveys and reports, the terms severely wasted and wasted are the terms that are being used.
Well, as long as you place that on record na hindi invention ng Pilipino yan, hindi invention ng DepEd yan, invention ng mga taga-WHO yan, then I will accept.
Who daw po ang nag-invento po niyan, hindi sila?
Hindi ko rin kasundo ang who sa RH eh. Kaya okay na yan. As long as it is nakalista sa kanila galing yan. Now, the next question is, ang tansya ninyo, 533,425. Why not feed all?
Based on the Senate amendments, Mr. President, Your Honor, it would also include the wasted children, for now a total of 1,918,464. In other words, our amendment would cover the 1,385,039 wasted pupils and students, and not only the severely wasted. Why not all, Mr. President, Your Honor? As I said earlier to the queries of Senator Poe, hindi na po feeding program ang tawag doon, party na ho ang tawag doon pag pinakain natin lahat ng estudyante araw.
Yes,
Given the lack of funds, I think who wouldn't want to provide that, Mr. President, Your Honor, for all students? However, this is, in fact, our increase in the budget of the DepEd's feeding program is the highest by far allocated for over 1.9 million students.
Kasi earlier, when you said pag nag-normal na, nawawala na sila sa kategory na yun, pag normal na. Pag normal na, hindi mo na pinakain, balik sa wasted yan. What natin ititigil?
It's a continuing monitoring and evaluation, Mr. President, Your Honor. And the program for 1 year is good for 120 days.
But if we feed all, let's go to the Escudero party.
Mr. President, Your Honor,
Magkano?
at approximately 13 million students, if we're spending 4.2?
13 million
If we're
students.
spending approximately 4 billion, so that's times 6. That's about 24 billion pesos, Mr.
24
President.
billion?
Your Honor. Yes.
That's only half of the CCT program.
Less than half, Mr. President.
Yes, less than half.
The CCT cash grant is at 57 billion.
Yes, Mr. President, I think that is really something to consider. And if you can't do it now, perhaps in the future, the Department of Education should work on that. Perhaps during the, if not now, perhaps during the presidency of either Binay or Escudero or some other.
Dinamay niyo pa ako dyan, kayo naman.
Pwedeng consider yan, ha? Kalahati lang ng CCT, ha?
It can be considered,
Yeah.
Mr. President, but the DepEd has some absorptive capacity concerns because to roll out such a program for over 13 million students would be too much at this time, Mr. President,
Okay.
Your Honor.
When
for
we
that.
say feeding program, ano ba yan? Lunch ba yan? Breakfast, lunch, o lunch lang?
Lunch, Mr.
Lunch
President.
lang? Pwede.
Pwedeng pag-aralan, Mr. President,
Yes,
Your Honor.
I suggest that the DepEd really consider the possibility. Lunch lang eh. Wala nang babalik sa wasted. Thank you, Mr. President. When you mentioned earlier in your speech about a feeding program, the quick response fund, and a chalk allowance, paki-explica nga natin sa mga kababayan natin, ano yung chalk allowance, Mr. President? Ano yan? Bibili talaga ng chalk?
Hindi po, Mr. President, Your Honor. Understanding ko, kaya tinawag na chalk allowance yan, ang binibigyan lamang po yung classroom teachers.
Na
Dahil sila po yung
okay.
naaanggihan ng chalk dahil sa sinusulat nila sa blackboard.
And how much is the chalk allowance, Mr. President?
Magkano yung binigay? Mr. President, Your Honor, last year it was at 1,000 per month. Last year it was 1,000, Mr. President, Your Honor. The GAB made it 1,3. We made it 1,5, Mr. President, Your Honor.
All right. For this year, 1.5.
For next year, Mr. President. For
Yeah,
next year.
I mean, sorry.
So this is an
Sorry, but this
existing
is budget.
program of the DepEd, chalk allowance.
Yes, Mr. President, Your Honor.
And the General Appropriations Bill or the National Expenditure Program provided for 1,300 per.
NEP was 1,000, Mr. President. GAB was 1,3. The Senate version is 1,5 because this is a one-time. Hindi po ito monthly, Mr. President, Your Honor. One time lamang ito.
One time lang for that particular year.
When you say one time, once in a year,
Yes.
once in a school year.
I
Once in
think so.
a year lang po.
Yes, once in a year. And again, ito yung mga para sa mga teachers na nagtuturo.
Classroom
in the
teachers.
classroom teachers, as you call it. Yes. Tawag lang yung chalk allowance. Baka ma-misinterpret ko kasi nung iba eh. All right. Now, about 1.9 billion is allocated to the Abot Alam program. May I know how the DepEd will implement the Abot Alam program?
This is for out-of-school youths, Mr. President, Your Honor. It is a barangay-based program which will target approximately 1 million out-of-school youths. It's a continuation of a previous program, Mr. President, Your Honor, that seeks to provide opportunities to finish basic education or acquire skills that will help them get employed or go into a small business.
How does the DepEd choose the 1 million out-of-school youths to ensure that those who will benefit most from the program will be chosen?
through the LGU input, Mr. President, via a census of each locality or each barangay. That's how they identify the aged 15 to 30 out-of-school youths, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Would you have a figure presently on the distribution of the 1 million out-of-school youths pasok dito? Pasok na ito, no? This is an ongoing program, no? Abot alam program. So, more or less, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao.
We have it by region, Mr. President, Your
Right.
Honor. We can furnish you the,
Oh, yes, please. Just
the data.
Furnish us a copy, Mr. President. That will be sufficient. Thank you very much. Yeah. All right. Now, under the capital outlay, the DepEd shall allocate 52.878 billion for basic education facilities, of which 44,660,000 shall be for the construction of classrooms. How many classrooms will be constructed out of the 44.660 billion, Mr. President?
31,728, Mr. President. Insofar as the number of classrooms is concerned, in the total amount of 44,660,000,000.
Will this cover the backlog for, say, 2013?
13 and 14, Mr. President, Your Honor.
To 14, up to 14.
Yes,
All
Mr.
right.
President, Your Honor.
Of course, sabi nyo nga, taon-taon nadadagdagan yung backlog, ano?
Apa.
As mentioned earlier. And what are the priority projects in relation to the construction of classrooms? May mga areas ba o provinces na priority? O basta nilalahat yan, encompassing yan?
It's only based on actual need and enrollment, Mr. President, Your Honor, because they compute the backlog based on the actual enrollment in a given school.
What if we want to put in additional budget for additional classrooms, Mr. President? Is that possible? Ano yan? Would it ease the backlog more? Yung bang pag sinabing wala ng backlog, ibig sabihin yan, isang klase, isang classroom? O yung dalawang klase, isang classroom pa rin?
Except for about 700 schools in the in the NCR area, Mr. President, where there is still shifting.
Yun na nga.
700
When we
schools
remove
na
the shifting,
lupa po ang problema, Mr. President, Your Honor, o mag-multi-level na po tayo. Pero in most areas in the NCR area, in most school sites rather, in the NCR area, 4 stories na daw po sila.
all right. So walang priority provinces dyan. Basta
Based on actual
lahat ng pagkukulang, lahat na may kulang, ano?
Apa.
But maraming classroom sa Batangas, Mr. President, na napapansin ko, yung mga recto classroom ba yun o recto building?
Marami po mga bata doon, Mr. President, Your Honor. At karamihan po ng mga classroom daw po doon ay kaya tinawagan na recto ay dahil LGU built, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Yes, okay. Yes. Around 200 million will be used for the acquisition of new school sites in urban areas. Are these sites already identified? What are these urban areas, Mr. President?
Ito lamang po, Mr. President, Your Honor, yung may mga kaso kung saan meron na pong naset na presyo para sa pag-acquire ng mga lupang merong issue o kasong na isampa.
What do you mean kaso, Mr. President?
Marami po kasing sitwasyon sa DepEd na tinayuan ng eskwelahan, may deed of donation on. Either nawala, hindi na-register, o binawi nung tumakbong kapitan at natalo.
Hinahabol.
Various situations, Mr. President, Your Honor, wherein the title is not in the name of DepEd or the national government. And a case was filed as a result of that.
Itong mga situations na to, ano yun, yung lote, kanino nakapangalan?
Either nakapangalan po sa pribadong individual o dati walang titulo, biglang napangalan o napatitulohan sa pangalan ng ibang pribadong individual, Mr. President, Your Honor, notwithstanding the fact that the school stands on that land.
And then the cases, pending cases or yung nagkakaroon ng kaso na sinasabi nyo is they're claiming they are the owner. Ganon.
There are about 400 pending cases, Mr. President, Your Honor, and in all cases, DepEd po palagi yung kinakasuhan at pinapaalis.
Ano bang batas natin dyan tungkol sa titulo ng lupa, yung mga tenants title about on properties?
What in particular, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Nakapangalan sa'yo. Titulo, nakapangalan sa'yo.
We have, under and by virtue of the property registration decree, Mr. President, Your Honor, as a general rule, outside the four corners of the title of a piece of land in your name, it cannot be questioned except via court proceedings for quieting of title. But in the case of DepEd, Mr. President, Your Honor, they have found situations wherein in most cases, Mr. President, wala po silang titulo, tax deck lamang ang hawak nila, at may ibang taong biglang nakapagpatitulo. But under, in accordance with jurisprudence, Mr. President, Your Honor, any title obtained by fraud is non-existent and can be questioned before the courts.
All right. I thank you for your explanation. I actually am tempted to divert a little and ask about titles and dummies, but medyo I will reserve it for another day. Walang new sites ito. Itong 200 million for these cases lang.
Konti lamang daw po dahil napakamahal na ng presyo ng lupa ngayon, but as I understand, the gap increased by 235 million this particular item, Mr. President, Your Honor.
So more or less mga magkano yung para sa new sites kapag sa 200 million usually to sa mga cases
500 million na po under the gap, Mr. President, Your Honor. Yan. Ang nakita niyo pong figure is as proposed under the NEP.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that. All right, good. Thank you. For cash allowances, hardship pay, and salary upgrading, you have 2.413 billion. How much increase in pay in percentage will public school teachers receive? And will this take effect this next year, 2015? Cash allowances, hardship pay, and salary upgrading. Yun ang masarap pakinggan eh.
Hardship allowance, Mr. President, Your Honor, ranges from 15 to 20% of their salary, but this is only made to apply in accordance with the law that Congress passed to hardship posts. Halimbawa, yung may, if I remember correctly, because I was one of the authors of that bill, yung maglalakad ka ng kung ilang kilometro, yung walang kuryente,
Tumatawid
na
ng
mga
ilog.
posts. They call it hardship posts, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Yeah, and the salary upgrading, Mr. President.
Ito yung mga tumataas po yung rango na po-promote, for example, from Teacher 1 to Teacher 2, Mr. President.
Okay. So, hindi lahat ito.
Hindi po lahat.
Hindi lahat ito. Okay. And this is effective when, Mr. President? Effective this year.
This year, Mr. President.
Pag-approve ng budget, yun na yun.
Continuing naman po yung
Alright.
pagpondo nila sa particular na item at gastusin yan po.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Around 8 billion will be allocated for the government assistance to students and teachers in private education, GASPE, to benefit 1,082,798 grantees. May we know the guidelines in choosing the grantees under this program and what is the rationale in initiating and perpetuating this program, Mr. President? Government assistance to students and teachers in private education. GASPE.
Mr. President, Your Honor, it's the private schools that qualify and choose the students based on guidelines issued by the DepEd, namely, for example, that they should come from low-income families and priority should be given to students coming from public schools, public
Yes.
elementary schools.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. When you mentioned the guidelines, given my, I just remembered, I think I was one of the principal authors of the law that created this. Thank you. There is 231 million intended for socio-economic component of the normalization process. Socio-economic component of the normalization process. What is this program, Mr. President, and what are the specific projects for this purpose?
This is for the adult literacy program of returning rebels or combatants, Mr. President, Your Honor, in line with the BBL commitments of the government.
Bago to.
Apo, bagong
This
item
is a
po.
new program, new item. That's why. All right. Thank you. I think that completes the information that I want to gather from the Department of Education. I have full trust and confidence in the leadership of the Secretary, and so I will no longer have any interpellations on the budget of the Department of Education. Mr. President, thank you very much to the sponsor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Your Honor. Next to interpolate, Mr. President, Your Honor, is Senator Legarda. But may I ask for a 1-minute suspension while we are coordinating with our staff?
Session suspended.
Hindi ako sa yung mahaba po. Mabuti pag yung ginawa kami sa hindi masyado mahaba.
Hindi mahaba. Saan ako? Saan ang walang get mo?
Ma'am, doon na lang kayo sa may aircon para
Hindi nga.
Okay.
Pass the budget.
Ma'am, walang aircon dito.
Sige.
Ready to resume, Mr. President?
Session is resumed.
Will the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee yield to questions and interventions that will only enhance the budget in support of the DepEd budget and the National Museum's budget on all the what are the attached agencies? None.
the National Book Development Board, National
Yes,
Council for
yes,
Children's
yes,
Television, National Museum, and Philippine High School for the Arts,
Yes,
Mr. President.
yes.
Willingly, Mr. President.
Yes, actually, these are not questions. These are suggestions, recommendations, and interventions which I am certain our chairman of the Finance Committee, who is a recent culture convert, will support. Not that you didn't understand or appreciate culture before. But thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to welcome the DepEd family and its attached agencies to the Senate once again, as I always do in the past years, if not decades, and I assure you of my continued support, not only for the approval of the budget. I hope I'm the last to interpolate so that you can all go home and we can all get back to work. But also, I would like to make sure that cultural preservation, which is the essence of who we are as a people, is mainstreamed in the DepEd budget and its attached agencies, especially the National Museum as well. I am referring, Mr. President, to the need to culturally map our country. What do I mean? I would like to find out whether cultural heritage mapping is integrated and mainstreamed in the DepEd budget and taught in the national high schools and in the basic education curriculum, where the 200 plus division heads of the DepEd can be used as cultural workers who can also be heritage warriors, who can actually mentor teachers under them, so that heritage culture mapping in various divisions, jurisdictions in our country can be done, Mr. President.
According to DepEd, Mr. President, Your Honor, that is in the curriculum, but largely locally based. But what they're doing right now and what's in the budget is linguistic mapping, in line with what the distinguished lady mentioned on in relation to culture and mapping of the same.
I appreciate the answer of the good sponsor, Mr. President. Yes, I am glad that there is a linguistic mapping. I would assume that that would refer to the documentation of our languages, Mr. President. I would like to suggest, therefore, with the permission of the chair, if you would support it, I am certain you will, and I'm glad that Brother Luistro, whom I met earlier, agreed that we must document not only built heritage, not only our languages, Mr. President, but both intangible and tangible heritage. What I'm saying is that in every town and city, in every province, perhaps the DepEd, through its superintendents, supervisors, its teachers, can train our teachers and even NGO workers to map their areas in terms of biodiversity, in terms of language, culinary arts, indigenous cultural practices, indigenous agricultural and environmental practices, and rituals, etc. This can be taught. It's actually being done in cities like Vigan, which is a UNESCO heritage site. It has been conducted as well in Bohol. And allow me just to cite this very touching anecdote, Mr. President. In Giwan, Eastern Samar, which was affected by Yolanda, when Yolanda struck, from what I hear from cultural worker and historian and Professor Eric Cerudo, he explained that what the people tried to save when Yolanda happened and what Mayor Kwan, Anak Kwan, if I'm not mistaken is her name, tried to gather were the documents or the compendium of cultural heritage mapping that Giwan Eastern Samar had. This is a very touching story of how people actually value their heritage and their culture and how they are able to try to save whatever is gathered by their people. So I'm just citing 3 areas where cultural mapping is done, but according to Professor Cerudo, whom we met earlier, thousands of teachers around the country have actually been trained already as heritage workers, Mr. President. So we wanted to put this on record so that the chairman of our Finance Committee would actually be in agreement with my proposal that cultural heritage mapping be mainstreamed in our budget, so that not only while we are here in the Senate in the next few years, but so that it is there perpetually and immortalized, because it is so important. And this can be done, Mr. President, also in areas where there are schools of living tradition. There are more than 100 SLTs all over the country. There are also national high schools where there are SLTs. Perhaps just like in Abra, where the Abra National High School teaches in its high school curriculum the anong tawag, tabungaw? Tabungaw making, which is an SLT of the indigenous Datingyans of Abra in the national high school curriculum. Imagine, Mr. President, if the more than 100 SLTs where there are IP groups could integrate their art and their intangible heritage in the high school curriculum of every DepEd high school where there are SLTs, would that not be an instrument in the preservation of our culture and heritage?
The DepEd is in agreement, Mr. President, Your Honor. In fact, according to them, they have an indigenous peoples education program, and in coordination with the NCCA, they have trained over 1,200 teachers precisely to do cultural mapping. But principally, Mr. President, through the NCCA's help and direction.
Thank you for that, Mr. President. That is why I always believe in the vision of Brother Armin Luistro, and that's why I was confident in coming to the podium today to suggest this, because I know that our DepEd family would be in agreement on giving primary importance to culture as well. And so, if I may suggest, Mr. President, since the NCCA has a database of our schools of living tradition, which they already support, and all we need to do is to get this database and put it together alongside the national high schools of DepEd, and they could actually coordinate with the division supervisors and superintendents so that the SLTs can be integrated into the national high school curriculum, if possible, when possible, Mr. President.
That data is with them, Mr. President. The 47 SLTs, 37 in Ifugao, 5 in Mindanao, 1 in Palawan, and 4 in the Cordillera, to include Abra already.
I am certain that there are more than 47, but I appreciate the fact that it's being done in 47. I'm certain that there can be much, much more. So this humble representation suggestion, Mr. President, is for cultural mapping to be done in the 200 divisions, if possible. And second, the integration and mainstreaming of schools of living tradition of our indigenous peoples in areas where there are national high schools, when also the school is willing and competent to do so. Just a suggestion, Mr. President.
According to DepEd, Mr. President, Your Honor, they are starting to do it and include it in their mainstream mandate. According to them, it does not really entail that much budgetary requirements, given that most of it is coming from the NCCA as well as the provincial or local governments.
You are correct, Mr. President. It is not a matter of budgetary allocation. It is really simply a matter of convergence and coordinating with the relevant agencies of government, and in this case, the NCCA. And it's just really a matter of the Secretary perhaps issuing a memorandum so that every school would actually understand which SLT is within their jurisdiction, and sort of for them to coordinate with perhaps even the NCIP in the area, Mr. President.
We will do that, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Thank you. Again, and this is in fact in line with the K-12 and with your with the programs K-12. And third and last, Mr. President, in the hearing I asked this and I received favorable support from Brother Armin, and I just want to put it on record as well. According to him, we have more than 100 Gabaldon-style buildings. I understand that not only the Gabaldon, but there are heritage structures even earlier than the Gabaldon style. For those who do not know, Mr. President, the Gabaldon style buildings are those which have the architecture style during the time when I think Gabaldon was a secretary, right, a cabinet member during the What era?
He was a congressman, Mr. President. Your
Congressman
Honor.
during which era? I wouldn't know. Not the era of Senator Escudero. But anyway, it is called as such. But I understand that there are heritage structures even earlier than the Gabandol-style building. May this representation be informed, Mr. President, whether the DepEd is actually trying to restore, preserve, rehabilitate such Gabaldon-style buildings, more than 1,000 of that, so that we will see the preservation of these structures. It would also bring pride of place to the teachers and the students who reside in those areas.
That is correct, Mr. President, Your Honor. They have identified 1,396 Gabaldon structures nationwide. They have restored about 200 of them, and we have inserted a new special provision on the preservation of Gabaldon school buildings in the proposed national budget for 2015.
I am so grateful to Your Honor for having accepted a special provision that this representation has introduced. Yes, the special provision, I believe, will ensure the protection of the Gabaldon building. Would Your Honor be amenable to providing for the upkeep and restoration of all the 1,000 Gabaldon buildings if possible?
Basta hindi po sabay-sabay sa loob ng isang taon, opo. We can
Kung 1,000,
coordinate with DepEd.
maski kalahati, pwede na rin, tapos sa susunod na taon ay kalahati. Kasi kung hindi po natin gagawin yun, ay baka hindi na makita ng iyong kambal ang itsura ng anong Gabaldon building. And in fact, this could be part of heritage tourism. The DOT, imagine, could have a tour in every area of the Gabaldon type buildings.
Magsusunog daw po sila ng kilay para computein kung magkano yung kailangan dun sa balanse ng 1,000 para malaman din kung magkano yung kailangan para po dun sa kalahati nun. But they will endeavor to utilize existing funds either for the construction of basic educational facilities in the 2015 budget or in their funds for repair and rehabilitation of classrooms.
May I just remind, Mr. President, that in the reconstruction or rehabilitation of such buildings, can we request that the NCCA and the NHCP be consulted? They are already.
They are already working with them, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to ask more questions, but I don't want to prolong the budget anymore. I am fully supportive of this. So just to recap, Mr. President, we will see the coordination between the NCCA and the SLTs in various areas, and it could be taught in national high schools when relevant. Second, we would have a cultural mapping of various towns and cities with the help of our teachers as our cultural warriors. And third, we will have the preservation and restoration of Gabaldon-style buildings and other heritage structures, partially for 2015 and onwards until 2016. Only if the chair agrees and if Brother Luistro agrees.
We are both in agreement, Mr. President, Your Honor. Yung pag-agree ni Secretary Luistro may kasama pang ngiti.
Actually, sinabi po niyang sabihin ko lahat ito. No, I'm just kidding. We spoke about it and we already agreed, and I simply wanted to put it on record so that it is immortalized that we have kept and we've attempted to preserve culture, because nabanggit ko lang po ito dahil masyadong pong how is it? It gives us anxiety and anger sometimes when you see the desecration of heritage structures. Wala nang makikita ang ating mga anak at ating mga kung wala silang ginawa kundi manira. Kaya ako'y natutuwa, nakakampi natin ang DepEd sa pag-conserve ng ating kasarinlan. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for your interventions, Senator Legarda, distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Senator Escudero.
Mr. President, no other member registered to interpolate or intervene on the proposed budget of the DepEd as well as its attached agencies. May I therefore move that we close the period of interpolation and debate. Thank you, ma'am. On the budget of the DepEd to include the Office of the Secretary Proper, the National Book Development Board, the National Council for Children's Television, the National Museum, as well as the Philippine High School for the Arts. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the period of interpolation for the budget of the Department of Education particularly the Office of Secretary, National Book Development Board, National Council for Children's Television, National Museum, the Philippine High School for the Arts, is hereby terminated.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, there being no other matters to be taken up insofar as the proposed budget. Wala na, no? Suspend na ako. Insofar as the proposed budget for 2015 is concerned, I move that we in the meantime suspend further consideration of the proposed budget for 2015. I so move, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we suspend until 10 a.m. tomorrow, November 20.
Session is suspended until tomorrow, Thursday, November 20 at 10 a.m. sharp.
Thank you, Mr. President.